Hey guys, it's Matt here, and today we're reviewing Hyperkin's SNES to SNES Classic Adapter. So the first thing we're going to need
is me. I know. But could you ask before getting third-party peripherals?
Actually, I already did.
Hey guys, what's the his apps? Hey Matt, are we still using that adapter? Wait, what?
Yeah, this thing actually allows you to plug in original Super Nintendo controllers into the SNES Classic Edition. Not you, Super Nintendo. I mean, I know that you're a classic Super Nintendo, but...
So I'm not needed here, right?
I'm sorry, Super Nintendo. If you want, I can include you in the video.
Oh, joy. I did not plan a trip to Cancun or anything.
Like I mentioned earlier, today we'll be reviewing the SNES to SNES Classic Adapter. It does work on the Wii and Wii U as well, but for the purposes of this tutorial, we'll just be using the SNES Classic Edition. The reason why I wanted to get this was because of the SNES Classic Edition controller. Now, I'm not trying to knock the controller at all. In fact, the directional pad is very responsive. However, when it comes to the actual A, B, X, and Y buttons, there's a bit of a problem with the A button. Now, as you can tell here, it's very, very low. But I do have to say though, the L and R buttons work just fine, as well as start and select. And comparing it to the controller that I got when I was 5, yes, you can see it's super duper beat up, but the buttons work just fine, and when looking at the A button over here, you can see that it's raised a little bit higher than the A button on the SNES Classic Edition's controller. Now that might not seem like much to you guys, but when playing certain types of games, that means a lot to me. Speaking of a game where response time matters, today I'll be using my original copy of Mega Man X to do a few comparisons. So let's fire up the original Super Nintendo and take a look at the footage. So when it comes to this footage, I'm obviously using the original Super Nintendo controller that I have on hand. Something very interesting is that it's not technically an original Super Nintendo controller. As you can tell, there was no Nintendo branding on the controller itself, but because of the time it was made, while it is third party, it still does work on an original Super Nintendo, unlike newer models of third party controllers that from what I can tell do not work on original Super Nintendos. So now let's fire up the SNES Classic Edition and take a look at this footage. When it comes to this footage, as you can tell, I am using the original controller that came packed in with the SNES Classic Edition. Now let's take a look at both of them side by side. Wow, that was kind of short, so how about we actually slow them down just to see if there's any lag with the SNES Classic Edition. Shockingly enough, it seems like the original SNES is actually faster than the SNES Classic Edition. And now let's plug in our adapter. As you can tell, you plug it in the exact same way you would plug in an SNES Classic Edition controller. And when you plug in your Super Nintendo controller, remember to make sure that you have the tabs lined up 3-4. Also something to note, you might need to put a little bit of force when plugging it in, but not too much force because we do want this thing to actually work. And now let's take a look at the footage. As you can tell, I'm playing just as well as I did earlier, although damn it, I hate those flying heads. They are the bane of my existence, and frankly, Mega Man X was annoying with them. However, other than that, and also dodos apparently, metal dodos, I am playing just like I was earlier. There doesn't seem to be any lag at all. But still, let's take a look at the two side by side. On the left hand side is an original SNES Classic Edition controller, and on the right hand side is actually my original controller plugged in to the adapter. And before we wrap things up, I want to show you guys a third-party SNES controller that I have. It's a terrible controller, so I'm not even going to try to play with it. The directional buttons are actually broken. A, B, X, and Y work just fine. The L and R works just fine, but the directional buttons are broken. However, I do want to mention that these do work with the adapter. They don't work on an original Super Nintendo like I mentioned earlier, but they actually do work on the adapter for some reason. So that's pretty cool, if the controllers were actually good from the get-go. So when it comes to this adapter, only having to pay $10 for it was one of the easiest decisions I've ever had to make. Being able to play HD versions of SNES games on my SNES Classic Edition alongside using my original controller really is the best of both worlds. If you have one of these, tell me what you think about it in the comments section down below. See, Super Nintendo, wasn't that fun?
Of course. So much more fun than Cancun.
I'm happy you enjoyed it. And what about you, Super Nintendo Classic Edition?
You want to go to Cancun? He doesn't even pay us enough to leave his living room.
Oh, Super Nintendo Classic Edition, what a card!